One of the reasons that I'm here on this earth, I believe, is to help us redefine trauma. Because for 150 years of clinical study, we've been looking at which kinds of events count as trauma and which do not. And the problem with that is that it doesn't take into account the person living through it.
I'm John Kim, a licensed therapist who used to be a miserable fuck before going on a hero's journey and turning expired relationships into revelations. I use my story to help others come with you instead of at you, unrehearsed on purpose, because self-help doesn't have to be polished or complicated, just honest.
So we're going to start with the definition of trauma.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah. What is trauma?
So one of the reasons that I'm here on this earth, I believe, is to help us redefine trauma. Because for 150 years of clinical study, we've been looking at which kinds of events count as trauma and which do not. And the problem with that is that it doesn't take into account the person living through it. And so the definition that I use in my work is really simple. You have trauma anytime you have an unbearable emotional experience that lacks a relational home. So unbearable emotional experience that lacks a relational home.
So using the ice, would that
be unbearable?
Yeah.
Yes. So potentially, right, you're giving yourself this really extreme experience. You're having these emotions come up, except we had this beautiful relational home set up by Sarah's beginning, and then also the fact that we were all around each other sharing in that experience so that we could situate it. Because otherwise you're just in the extreme without the relational home and you have no one you can share that with.
So if you had the same experience, but someone pushed you in the ice and then you got out and there was no one to kind of hold safety and you're just running out of the woods, that could be traumatic.
Yes.
Right?
Yep. For sure. Actually, one of the things that helped me really work on my definition of trauma was a story from John.
Yeah, so we think of trauma as usually sexual assault or combat war. The masses think of trauma that way. I've had clients and I'm like, well, I've never had any trauma. And then we start talking and of course, everyone has that trauma. And I use this example just because it's silly. So I've never had, or to my knowledge, I've never had any kind of molestation or sexual stuff, or even like serious bullying. But in high school, someone stole my skateboard, and they only stole my skateboard for like 30 seconds. And one could argue like, that's ridiculous. If you know my story, that is not traumatic at all. But here's what's kind of traumatic, what was traumatic for me. So it wasn't that someone stole my skateboard. I've been begging my mom to buy me this Christian Hosoi skateboard that she didn't have money for. And back in the day, it was a $100 skateboard. And you know, back in the 80s, 90s, that's like a lot of money for a skateboard. She finally bought it for me. And then I had all the things on it. The first day I rode it to school, someone grabbed it and took it. And so in that moment, the 30 minutes of this person taking it, I didn't have a relational home. There was unsafety. And it wasn't just a skateboard, it was the story of begging for it, her finally buying it. She didn't have the money to do it, but she took me and did it for me anyway. And then me thinking I have to go home and telling her that I don't have it anymore. So to me, that was more traumatic than the actual taking of the skateboard. But I use that example because it's so silly, or it can be, that just someone took your skateboard for 30 minutes. How can that be traumatic, right? So the meaning of it, the story around it, and my interpretation of what happened is what makes it traumatic.
And also the way that it seeps into your later life. So I remember the first time we talked about this, I don't know if you remember this, you were talking about scarcity mentality in terms of physical belongings and how you felt like this maybe outsized sense of scarcity around stuff. And that was actually how that story came out. Was that, so these things trauma can be very sneaky and subterranean, and it can impact your behavior in all areas of your life, which can sound scary, but it's also an exciting opportunity to work through things, because instead of having to delve into the past, we can work with the symptom in the moment. And so I think that that's really exciting. I think it might be helpful to break down the definition a little bit and talk about what goes on in your brain and body when you have trauma, if that's okay.
Yes.
So the reason that I like unbearability as the first part of the definition is because it sets the bar sufficiently high so that we don't stretch the term to meaninglessness. Because in psychology, just like in medicine, if trauma is just like how we are all the time, we're all traumatized by everything, we don't really need to study it anymore. Just like we don't really study the common cold. There used to be a whole division of study for the common cold. We don't do that anymore because it's just assumed to be a part of life. And we don't want to do that with trauma. We want to make sure that we have research dollars and we're thinking about it and figuring out which interventions are most effective for which kinds of trauma and all of that. So unbearability raises the bar sufficiently high, but it also maps on really nicely to what's going on in your brain and body when you have something that's significantly overwhelming. So when we have a regular event, right? Like let's say, last night we had this nice time together and we had dinner and we hung out. Nothing super overwhelming happened, right? It might have been intense. We had deep conversation, but it was essentially something that we could incorporate and integrate into our memory system pretty easily. Within 4 to 24 hours after any event, your brain makes a neat little file. And this is where I always say, if anyone knows anyone at Pixar, let's make a movie about this. Because if we understood memory better, we would shame ourselves a lot less. So between 4 and 24 hours, these little dudes, you can imagine these, I imagine Pixar animated dudes, in the back of your brain in an area called the hippocampus, create a memory file.
Inside out.
Yeah, yes, but just memory. Exactly. And so in the file, you have the narrative content. The narrative has to have coherence, beginning, middle, and end. Just like you were talking about before with the hero's journey, right? There's an arc that ends. The second thing in the folder is the emotional content. Was it a funny thing that happened? Was it a sad thing that happened, right? What are the emotions that go with that story? And then there's a set of meaning tags that your brain uses to bring forward memories when it needs to look at them and reference them and put them away. And so when we talk about the skateboard story, the meaning tags are probably the most significant thing of that story, because what that meant for you, even though now at 50, that might seem like a very small thing, or from the outside, it might seem like a very small thing. That significance, the meaning of that loss was everything, because you lost belonging. You had to then reckon with your parent who had spent so much time and money buying this thing for you. So it was this really big deal. So when a normal event happens, you get all of that stuff within 4 to 24 hours. When you have something that's unbearably emotional, and emotions are biological events. They're not these things we can like opt in and out of. They are biological events. You can think of them like a tunnel. You have to get through them to get out. And so when we have something significantly overwhelming, our beautiful, sophisticated, amazing system adapts because it thinks we're in danger. And it reprioritizes function and blood flow in 47 different parts of your brain and body, which is a miracle. And unfortunately, one of the things that goes offline is that file system. So instead of this neat file, because if you think about it, you don't need to be doing filing when you're like running away from a wolf, when you're in an emergency situation. So the thing that happens is you get a fragmented file. So those little guys in the file room are doing something else. They're preparing you for threat and danger and helping you get ready for what you're about to encounter. So they run out of the file room and stuff gets thrown into the file room, but not in an organized fashion. Right? And so the result of that is that then there's these fragments, and the little guys in the file room don't like that. They want everything to be organized. And so anytime they recognize something in your periphery that is from that file, it's like, oh, there's that Post-it note, that color orange, that's important. It might be dangerous. And it throws the file to the front of your brain. The problem is the alarm system in your brain also recognizes that as danger, and you're off to the races. So when you have a normal event, you have a very organized file that gets put away and can get taken out and then put back in whenever you need. When you have something that's got that unbearable emotion attached to it, which again can be anything, there's not a list of things that we can figure out that always do that or don't, you get a fragmented file. And then that fragmented file creates a problem for your brain. And that is where the trigger comes from. The thing that I want you to take away, if you take away absolutely nothing else, is the fact, biologically, that the trauma response is a strength response. It is not a sign of weakness or disorder. It is there to keep you alive. Because if those little file dudes kept doing what they were doing, instead of went and did what else needed to be done, you wouldn't stay alive. We need that for evolution, for survival. Things go haywire and we start to get symptoms when we get stuck in the trauma response. And that can happen in really obvious ways where we are triggered all the time, or where we have a very, I think one of the reasons why we come down to a list of things that are traumatic is that it's very easy to see in some circumstances. If you've gone to combat, for example, there's a set of triggers that we can likely predict for you that might cause this response. But when you have your traumatic event is something more subterranean, something that is not recognized, then it gets a lot sneakier and harder to pin down. And so what happens is the trauma wants to be healed. I think I said this morning that there's this dynamic tension at the center of trauma. It wants to come forward, and then it also wants to hide. And so it's at war with itself until it gets integrated. And so when that starts to come up, your system will also start to shut down. And that can create these very confusing, very distressing symptoms around trauma. And we get tricked because of shame and bad science into thinking we are broken. We are not. In fact, the sign of the symptoms is showing us that we are functioning as we are supposed to. We just need to recalibrate the system.
So let me ask you something. I'm going to use this, although generic, it's just because it's so common. Since I've been working in nonprofit with teenagers to adults, sexual abuse, sexual assault, I would say, 3 out of 5 people, right? So let's say in your childhood, it's 8 years old, something happened, there was some sexual abuse. So because it was traumatic and unsafe, the filing, what happens filing-wise?
You get a
fragmented file. And then I know this is different for everyone, but then how does that trauma then manifest, ripple through your life? Because that's kind of the virus, right? Yes.
The fragments and what fragments. And this is actually one of the things that makes trauma so fascinating to study and also so difficult, because the symptoms can be anything. And so for a really long time, way back in the 1800s, we didn't understand what was happening because there wasn't like a set of symptoms that conformed in every case. It was different for some people would be really activated, some people would be shut down. Some people would be able to connect with other people, some people wouldn't. And so,
a simple example of that is a lot of people go through, have had sexual trauma, either, let's say, teenagers or 20s, they're either very sexually active or they're completely go the other way. And they're very, disconnected or purposely gain a lot of weight or kind of protect themselves in that way. So it's unique to the experience.
Yes, totally. Yeah. And so the symptoms can kind of come out in any way. What you will notice is dysfunction and distress in your life in some way, a block. So it could be, you were talking last night about the getting close and feeling like I'm ready to have intimacy, and then boom, I can't, right? It can come out in your professional life if you continue to hit a ceiling of success and you find yourself self-sabotaging. It can come out in all sorts of different ways, which is both frustrating, but we can still work with it, because when we notice and tune into where we are headed and what's getting in the way, then we can work with what's getting in the way, right? If we aren't aware and we're just charging forward, that's when we really get in trouble. So to go back to the kind of more simple example of someone who's had, an assault early on, that could result in it, and it often kind of splits into two paths. So you have someone who hides and doesn't have any sexual intimacy at all, doesn't feel like that's possible for them. And then the other side, which doesn't get talked about enough, in my opinion, is a hypersexuality, because it's an attempt to take back control of that area of life that got stolen. And both of those things are adaptations that are chosen compulsively, which again, we can't shame those things because they are the system's attempt to adapt and protect. Once we have awareness, we can choose different adaptations, but we need to have that awareness and also push away the shame first.
Talking about trauma bonds, right? What is the definition then? This is a term we hear all the time. Bonding through trauma. Trauma being the glue. What is your definition of a trauma bond?
So this is an area that often gets taken up on social media and kind of misdefined. And so I think it's important, words matter. And it's important that we know what we're talking about when we're talking about a trauma bond, because it doesn't mean we went through a trauma together, right? That's something different. It doesn't mean Stockholm syndrome. That's something different. A trauma bond happens when you have unresolved things in one or both people. And, John was talking last night about the dynamic. So you have each person and then you have the relationship dynamic. The unresolved stuff gets fed into the dynamic and then creates the situation where you have intermittent abuse and very intense affection and connection. And so that abuse can take many, many forms. It doesn't necessarily have to be physical. It could be emotional. It could be pretty covert psychological abuse. I think it's very important that we understand that often when people are abusive, it's not a willing thing. It's something that's happening compulsively, which doesn't mean it's okay, of course, but
It could be a reaction to their story, their wiring, right? It could be them coping, right? Yeah.
so
Also be an addiction. Can you become
I'm so glad you asked. Yes, because here's what happens. This roller coaster that we've all been talking about.
Yeah, I love you, get away. I love you, get away.
Yes.
Yeah, simply put.
There are chemicals that get involved in your brain when you are in that roller coaster. And so when you get the intense affection and then the abuse, number one, that's profoundly confusing for your brain. Your brain doesn't know how to categorize this person, where to situate yourself in the relationship. But then number two, you get a lot of stress hormones and then you get reconnection and a ton of bonding chemicals, oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin, and you get addicted to that flood. So you're not addicted to the abuse. That's super critical to understand. You're addicted to what comes after the abuse, the rebonding time.
The honeymoon.
The honeymoon, yeah. And so like,
what a drug addict feels.
exactly. And those are the same chemicals. Yeah. Some of the same chemicals.
As opposed to if a relationship is safe and consistent, those chemicals aren't firing. They're more spread out.
It's like a more sustainable fuel source. So the chemicals are there, but in a way that's like more.
It's a drip.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Last. Right.
Yes. Yes.
Yep. And so you've also got tons of stuff going on in your brain and your body. There's inflammation because there's stress hormones happening. You don't feel like yourself. And then you get this blast of good feelings and you don't really know what to do with that either. And so the result is that you use the word disoriented a minute ago, which is perfect. You just end up disoriented. I don't know, and exhausted. Your system is stressed and it's like, I don't know how to leave. What do you mean leave?
I think also on top of that, the other layer is society paints that as passion. So when we were just talking about Tommy Lee and Pamela Anderson in the 90s, remember all of that? Yeah. Angela Jolie and Billy Bob Thornton and how they were like wearing vials of blood. So a lot of that kind of just super intense roller coaster, you can mistake as, oh, this is passion. This is the one. I've never felt this way. So then you put the relationship on high and think it's so special when what's really going on is this ride and the starvation and injection of chemicals.
And then it gets worse because we don't integrate. We turn to shame and we blame ourselves for getting into the situation again. And then we stay single for a certain amount of time. And then we get into another relationship and the exact same thing happens.
So enter love addiction.
Right.
Yeah. Yes, addicted to love, addicted to this chemicals, the starvation and injection of chemicals. And so you can't be alone because instead of heroin, you're actually addicted to this ride.
Yeah.
And you don't want to get off. So
you've trauma bonded your whole lives, if that's the term, and then you get out of it. Or that's called the love addiction?
No, I'm saying you could be addicted to love. If you find yourself, you can't be alone. You're only in relationships and you just go from one lily pad to another seeking these highs and lows.
It's super important to understand. There's another term that's maybe helpful, which is repetition compulsion. And this comes all the way back from the 1800s. Freud was trying to understand, like, okay, so if the human body is driven for pleasure, why do we repeat negative things? Why do we repeat in our dreams? We have nightmares when we could dream of anything. Like, what is it about human psychology that drives us towards repeating traumatic things? And it's an incredibly well-documented phenomenon that people repeat traumatic things in wild ways. Like, there's one story of this guy who repeatedly got into a shootout with the police, having no memory, like on the same day every year for 5 years, having no memory of the initial event, which was an accident where he got involved in a shootout with the police. And then every year on the same day, he would like get himself into the same situation. And so there is an incredibly strong drive to repeat. And it's so strong that Freud actually called it a demonic force. And then he was like, that's too much. Let's call it compulsion. And so it's important to understand that that thing that's in us that does that is compulsive. It's not a willing choice. We're driven to repeat. And I think that can go to a very hopeless place. But again, if we look at the whole system as adaptive and we put away the shame for a second and we try to say, okay, what is my system trying to do? It's trying to give you another opportunity to integrate something you haven't yet integrated. The best way to do that is to relive it. And so when you haven't integrated a relationship and what happened and your role in it and how it went sideways, sometimes we repeat because it's like, oh, here's the canvas again. Let's do it again and see where we went wrong.